Now, if we reconsider the issue, that does this mean that the writers of the middle of 18th century skipped the traditional interest in Greek and Roman classics? No, they did. They did not skip that influence. This interest did not disappear, but it started to be accompanied with a new spirit as well. What is that new spirit? The influence of sentimentalism, stemming from the religious shared compassion, shifted the interest from reason, from rationality, to emotions, and stressed on on an emotional approach in writing. They did not. Now I mean, the writers of this period also reserved their interest in the Greek and Roman classics, but they inject their works with some sentimental aspect, which we have already discussed, that it has stemmed from the religious or shared religious compassion. Okay, so now the interest shifted from pure reason to reason and emotions, to a stressed approach on to stressing an emotional approach in writing poetry and literature. And although those this new spirit of using or articulating emotions in the poet's work, yet they kept their precise polished couplet. You remember that the form is very important for the neoclassical poets, and the intellectual tone is also important, but they didn't give up these 2 points, but they added the emotional aspect. The new spirit started to creep from the static and didactic tendencies. The instructional, the teaching tendencies of the neoclassical started to have a new spirit of discussing feelings, or feeling man's individualism. That man should also be discussed in reference to his individualism and to his liberty and freedom. Sentimentalism brought the cult of sensibility. Now, sentimentalism, which was discussed in the neoclassical poetry, in the late neoclassical poetry, now added another cult, another, let's say, tradition of sensibility. What do we mean by sensibility? It means that we become aware of and responsive toward feelings and emotions. And the greatest representative English writer representative of sensibility is Thomas Gray. He believed that there is nobility of all mankind, and this nobility might have been prevented by man's circumstances to show itself to the surface. So he believes that each man has his own individuality, his own virtues and nobility. It is not only for the rich people who are characterized with this nobility. Okay, but sometimes our circumstances prevent us from showing this nobility and these virtues on the surface, and we are overlooked. We are not seen by others who are considered as famous or important in our society. Now, Gray, who is Gray? He was a very slow. How did Gray write? He was a very slow writer because he was always striving for perfection. And this is part of his neoclassical attitude, that classical poets were striving for perfection in their form, in using elevated language. And when he wrote his elegy, written in a country churchyard, it cost him about 7 years to finish. Because of his self-critical attitude, he used to revise his work more than once and change it more than once until it becomes, in his eyes, it becomes perfect. Though his literary output is rendered the less among his great contemporaries, although his work was very little, yet his works are accounted of the finest works written in the English language. Now we will talk about the elegy, his elegy written in a country churchyard. He wrote this poem in 1742. He was inspired by thoughts that he got after the death of one of his friends, the poet Richard West. So he started writing it in 1742, which means about 9 to 10 years before, 7 to 8 years before it was published. And the first version of the poem was titled "Stanzas Wrote in a Country Churchyard," not elegy. The second version, which had the title of "Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard," was published after many revisions, and he restrained the first 18 stanzas of this poem, of the first version, and then the last 4 stanzas were rejected and replaced by new stanzas. This is his self-critical attitude. The final version of the poem was completed in 1750, and it was published in 1751. Now we have to know what is an elegy. An elegy in Greek means to lament, to mourn. It is a solemn and formal lyric poem about death. It may mourn a particular person or reflect on a serious and tragic theme, like the passing of youth or losing beauty. So it is either mourning a particular person, or it represents a discussion of a serious or tragic theme, like losing our beauty, losing our youth, and all these things, or maybe losing justice, losing heroism, and like these issues. By mourning a person, when we mourn a person, the poem is going to elevate him and make him public. Now, is this the purpose of Thomas Gray in writing this elegy? We have to know, why did he choose the elegy form in presenting his poem? The literary form, or what are the features that are very important about the elegy that makes him choose the elegy form, the elegy genre, instead of choosing any other genre in showing his poetry, in writing his poetry? The form of elegy renders itself to contemplation and reflection. This is the main point, that Gray chose the elegy form in order to show his contemplation, his overthinking about some issue. Gray's intention was not to elevate a certain person. He was not intended to make his his friend, the poet, the dying poet, public, or he honors him in this elegy. The purport of Gray's elegy is of meditation on the lives of the ordinary people who are now buried in the churchyard. So this is the main point. This is the main issue. This is the main content. The purport is the content of his elegy, is that he wanted to contemplate and meditate on the lives that these ordinary people were living before they are now buried in the churchyard. He contemplates the obscurity into which death will overwhelm us all. He also contemplates, or he thinks over, the unrecognized paths through which death will overwhelm us, take us into its realm. The destiny of all men is death. The recognized and the unrecognized. The recognized, the poor, the rich people, the famous people, leaders, politicians, poets, literary men who are recognized and known by all people, and the obscure and the unknown people are all equal in the process of diving into the realm of death. This is his purpose. Now we have to look generally to the poem. The poem is a halfway poem between neoclassical poetry and romantic poetry. We have taken neoclassical features, and we will see through our discussion of the stanzas, we will see some elements that are related to neoclassical poetry and some elements are related to romantic poetry. It is typically a pre-romantic poem. It is a transitional poem. Gray was much interested in the history of English poetry, showing himself as a good example of the way where imagination and scholarship reinforce each other. Gray has read a lot about the English history. He has a good knowledge about the history of or the historical development of the English poetry, and he reached a conclusion that imagination and the scholarship reinforce each other. We cannot make poetry great or remarkable by using only imagination or by using only scholarship and knowledge. We have to make a blend between these two elements in order to get great poetry, because they reinforce each other. He tended to shift the poetic taste and widen the literary horizon beyond the boundaries of Augustan assurance. Ladies, Gray was intended to do what? He wanted to widen, to expand the literary horizon, which was based on the Augustan assurance, formative, topical, moral assurance. He wanted to add some other taste to his writing and to other poets' writings in order to make this blend successful and informative. The whole poem, of course, he is going to do this through this elegy. The whole poem is said to give a sense of personal emotion, universalized by form. So there is personal emotion and form. Emotion, which represents imagination, emotional side, sentimental side, sensibility, and they are all put in the accurate form, just like the neoclassical. So emotion is related to romanticism, and form is related to neoclassical. Now we have to know in the poem, where is the neoclassical? First of all, the neoclassical points or elements in the elegy appears where, number one, in its polished expression of ideas and use of balanced phrases and sophisticated vocabulary. We know, ladies, we have already known that neoclassical school emphasizes the use of accurate vocabulary, formed language and elevated language, and we will see this in the elegy. So it reserves this neoclassical element. Also, it keeps the other element, which is the elevated language, confirming thus the neoclassical poetic diction. So it emphasizes vocabulary, sophisticated vocabulary, balance of phrases, and a good expression of ideas. Adding to this, it is the elegy is also adherent to the neoclassical poetic diction. Now, but still yet it seems to have romantic elements also. In which aspects? Number one, the poem shows a new interest in nature. We are going to see from the very beginning of the poem that there is a good interest in nature, using nature as a landscape, just like the romantic poets. And number two, there is a new interest in humans' individualism, as we said, when the poet shows an interest in the life of the common folk, of the trodden people, of the obscure, unrecognized people. And number three, the poem highlights feelings and expression of emotions. It also emphasizes feelings, emotions, and the expression of imagination, expression of emotions, and not restricted to reality and intellectuality. Now, the elegy is distributed into three parts. The first part, as we said, it shows primarily the interest in nature. It includes 4 stanzas. The poet contemplation of the landscape, making a reference to the signs that foreshadow that. Sorry, ladies, here it is that foreshadow the idea of death and man's mortality. So part 1 is the introductory part, which sets or which articulates the setting of the poem, time and the place, and using nature as a landscape. Of course, nature is related to the graveyard. In part 2, it is discussing the consideration of short and simple annals of the poor and the obscurity of the poor's destiny. Now, in part 2, he's going to discuss the life of the common folk, and it shows, and the poet shows in this part his consideration of the simple ways that the poor can get, the simple opportunities that the poor can get, and that's why they become obscure. And obscurity is the thing that draws their destinies. In part 3, depending on part 1, the writer is going to reach a conclusion, which is the moral idea, and which arises from the discussion of part 2. And then there is the epitaph, in which the writer or the poet, Thomas Gray, returns to his own self and contemplates his own situation as a poet, as a human being, and how he's going to go through his, let's say, trip of death. Good morning, dear ladies. Today we will start with the discussion of the poem, starting with the first part of the poem, which is concerned with establishing the setting. The first 4 stanzas of the poem are sorry, establishing the setting, the place, and the time. A full description of the place and the time. From the very beginning of the poem, we will see that the writer is employing some romantic elements by refuging himself to nature and to his surroundings of the countryside, and especially of the churchyard. And he does not describe these elements of nature quite directly. He uses the sounds and the sights. He uses his senses to in the description of nature. And this sensual description is a very important element in the romantic poetry. The first 4 stanzas of the elegy are introductory stanzas. They present the setting of the poem. He draws the melancholy atmosphere of death in the poem, and he draws it indirectly in the first 3 stanzas. He mentions only signs of the countryside which foster the feeling of the approaching death. Now he listens to the bells of the herd of a cattle, using the word knell, as you see in the first stanza. He says the curfew tolls the knell of parting day. The knell is the sound of bells used to inform death or funeral. They are the bells ringing in the church to inform or to announce death or a funeral of somebody. These signs are all sensed by the poet. As we said, it is a sensual description by using senses to foreshadow or anticipate the idea of human mortality. And everything is leading the poet to feel the end, as he is now feeling the end of the day. He says of a parting day, of a day that is ending. And this parting day, all these signs are leaving the world to darkness, to night, and to me. Now he is now, when he says it leaves the world to darkness and to me, it means to me to contemplate this world, to contemplate its ending, to contemplate, of course, this is a suggestion of the idea of death. He moves in stanza 2 to the description of the landscape of nature that lost its glimmer or glamour because silence is overwhelming the universe and everything becomes peaceful. He says that all the air a solemn stillness holds. It means that either the air holds stillness and silence, or the solemn stillness, this melancholy calmness, holds and grasps the air, the atmosphere, he means. When silence is overwhelming the universe and everything becomes peaceful. The calmness of the air and its solemn stillness increases the somber tone, the melancholy tone that started in stanza 1. Then he adds in stanza 2 another mourning owl. The owl's sound as if it is moaning, moaning, moaning. It means what? It means complaining. تنوح. The moping owl does to the moon complains. It complains to the moon of what? Of her sorrows and pains. In all of these three stanzas, the poet does not refer to death in a direct way. But in the fourth stanza, now he is going to tell the reader that this is the graveyard. He draws the reader's attention to the graves in the country churchyard. Two contrasting images of death are presented. One is the image of the heaps of earth surrounding the grave, beneath the rugged elms that yew tree shade, where heaves the turf in many a moldering heap. The image shows how the earth is disrupted and spoiled when digging a grave, because there are heaps surrounding the grave, heaps of sand or of soil. The other image of the cruel forefathers who are buried beneath this disrupted earth while they are seemingly resting in. Although the forefathers are sleeping, yet they are not sleeping. It is suggested that they are resting in peace, but they were cruel. They were cruel forefathers because their graves disrupted the ground. It is important to sum it up, ladies. It is very important to know that the first four stanzas are establishing the setting of the elegy. They also suggest the poet's melancholy as the presence of death makes him contemplate his own death, as far as he is he is a mortal creature, just like those who are buried in these graves. All the signs he encounters surrounding his landscape are imaging the darkness to the world and to the poet himself. Also, there is a very important point concerning the introductory stanzas is the rising ambiguity intended by the poet by inverting the word order. In stanza 4, when the writer describes the heaps of earth surrounding the graves, he gives a corrupted syntactical or syntax order. Because instead of saying where the turf heaves, this is the turf is the subject and heaves is the verb, he makes a shift in the subject turf and introduces the verb heaves. He says heaves turf. Similarly, this is presented in many parts of the poem, not only in the first stanzas, to foreshadow the ambiguity of death itself. So the syntactic disorder reflects what? Reflects the thematic disorder, the ambiguous themes, the thematic ambiguity. Also, this disruption of syntax has been reflected in the fourth stanza through, as far as it is not also, ladies, through the image of the disrupted earth. Yeah. Um, of the countryside, nor can they enjoy their family lives. The truth of death is overwhelming. The proud graves of the rich and the lowly bed of the humble. So he makes an equation in which he equalizes between the poor people and the humble, the ordinary, the poor people, the rich people and the rich, both of them, whether their graves are proud, showing pride, showing richness. All the lowly bed, the humble graves of the poor, they are equal under in this equation of death. Both of them are overwhelmed by the truth of death. In stanza 7, where the speaker describes plowing and agriculture, he tends to be closer to the romantic elements as he associates man with nature, reconsidering nature as a cause for man's happiness as he has lost in death. That he has lost in death. Ladies, here he makes what? He says, of the harvest to their sickle yield, their furrow oft the stubborn glebe has broke. How jocund did they drive their team afield, how bowed the woods beneath their sturdy stroke. Now, these works that the farmers used to do, the plowmen, the farmers, working in the in harvesting the seeds they grow, working on the field, all these experiences are very joyful experiences to them, although these experiences are happy, but they are now overwhelmed by death that deprive them of enjoying these experiences. This stanza is very important for two things. On the thematic layer, it shows that death is overwhelming man, while and at the same time it shows the romantic element when the writer is emphasizing the joy that man can take from nature. Nature is a very overwhelming element in the romantic poetry. Now we are moving from stanzas 8 to 14, and in these stanzas there is a very important consideration for the poet when he is contemplating the lives and the deaths of those poor people. In these stanzas, the poet considers um, uh, these lives and their death, and he warns the reader not to look down at the humble and most dusty graves of the poor people. He challenges the reader that had those humble and poor people given an equal opportunity of the famous and honored people, they would have become great emperors or waked the living liar. It means that they had their own imprints, their own influence, their own impacts in this layer of life. Or would have been great poets or musicians, but their destiny met them obscure, unrecognized people. Okay, the poor were never able to fulfill their political or artistic potential because of poverty. Poverty overwhelmed their lives. They were so attentive to how to get their living, to earn their living, and they did not give themselves. In fact, poverty did not give themselves did not give these poor people the opportunity to enjoy life and to discover their own potentials, their talents. Maybe they had hidden some political or artistic potential, but because of their poverty they were frozen. Their poverty froze the genial of their souls. Okay, so this last line of stanza 13 is very important because it shows how poverty, how the hardships of life caused them to be frozen under its influence, because were unable and uneducated to get enough knowledge that elevates them from their poverty to some good status, or some status that makes them famous and known, just like, for example, poets or artists or politicians like Cromwell or Milton. So now he gives a very beautiful metaphor, or let's say not yeah, metaphor of the gem and the flowers in the fourth the 14th stanza. Is very important. Let's read it. He says, full many a gem of purest ray serene, the dark unfathomed caves of ocean bear, full many a flower of full many a flower is born to blush unseen and waste its sweetness on the desert air. Now he compares the talents, the buried, the frozen genius of the poor souls, the frozen talents, the unseen potentials and talents of these poor people to two objects: the gem, the jewel, which is unseen because it is buried under, it is drowning in the depth of the oceans, and unseen. The ocean only knows of their presence, of this gem's presence, and the flowers which is grown in the desert. So precious stones and precious flowers, when they are unseen and unknown, they will seem as useless because they are not discovered yet. No one takes no one knows about their sweetness, so they are just like a waste. He says, and waste is its sweetness on the desert air. So like gems hidden deep under the ocean, and like desert flowers, they have been perished without notice. Given opportunities, it means had they been given opportunities, they would have also succeeded. People would have read their deeds in history. Now we can see in this part of the poem that there are certain points which are very important. I mean, to summarize it up, number one, these stanzas invoke the idea of memento mori, a Greek reference to the idea that remember that we all must die, literally a reminder of mortality. So these stanzas, they emphasize the idea of mortality. Number two, the speaker here is using personification when he characterizes death as a man who cannot be flattered by the rich to change his mind. In one of the lines, he says that this death is inevitable, and it is a truth, the truth that overwhelms both the poor and the rich. And the rich cannot flatter him and give him riches or gifts in order to change his mind and not take their lives. So here there is a personification of death. Number three, there are the metaphors of the gem and the flower, as we have already discussed. Thomas Gray compares the obscure, the unrecognized talents of the poor to the pure gems hidden in the ocean or a flower blooming in desert. Both are wasted for being unrecognized and unseen. Ladies, here we are going to end this part of the recording, and we will continue the recording starting from the stanzas 15 and 16.